Merriam-Webster defines fascism as a popular political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, that is associated with a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, and that is characterized by severe economic and social regimentation and by forcible suppression of opposition. Some of these factors, such as populism and nationalism, arguably require the rise of democratic nation-states, and you can't place race above the individual before you create the idea of race, as we've discussed in other videos. Other parts of the definition, for example, a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, and severe economic and social regimentation by forcible suppression of opposition, have been part of government since the earliest societies formed. But even these very old ideas manifest differently in a global industrializing society. Few openly argue they want to elect dictators who will end democratic processes, and yet fascists still rise to power through ostensibly democratic processes because they're able to convince a significant number of voters to support them, and then use this support to gain enough power to never have real elections again. And to understand how this has happened multiple times, I think you have to understand the history of how violent authoritarians first gained power, and that starts with farming. As humans shifted from hunter-gatherer cultures into more agrarian cultures, a fundamental problem arose: the need to defend crops. A hunter-gatherer group generally keeps moving, as otherwise they would use up all the resources in a given area before they could replenish. But if you plant a crop in the spring and someone comes in the fall and takes it from you by force when it's time to harvest, the time and labor you put into the farming was lost to whoever was strong enough to take it from you. You became what was hunted, your crops what was gathered. But over time, bandits learned that if they took so much that the farmer starved, or even if the farmer stopped planting, that there would be nothing for the bandits to steal, and eventually they would also starve. So farmers either pooled resources to build or hire a protective military force to protect them from the bandits, or the farmer and the bandits negotiated deals that were better than mutual starvation. Whichever path was chosen, a codependent warrior class emerged, and the leader of this class would more or less have a local monopoly on violence. But leaders don't live forever. Changes in leadership among those inclined to violence are inherently problematic, as warriors can't defend your crops if they're occupied in the business of killing each other in power struggles. Cultures developed rules and laws around lines of succession, the most common following family lineage rules. Over time, this pattern was seen over and over again, creating more or less all of the various flavors of hereditary rule seen all over the world. And over time, in nearly every culture in the world, religious stories developed around these dynastic rulers that claimed the right to leadership had been ordained by some higher power, which was worshipped in that area. Implicit with this story was that anyone acting against the ruler acted in defiance of this higher power. This connection between church and state meant conflicts between rulers would become de facto holy wars, since the successive failure of a ruler was now connected to the ruler's religion. As holdings expanded into empires, smaller rulers, rather than being conquered and losing all power, instead would enter into agreements that allowed them to become vassals of a more powerful leader, not unlike the first farmers who gave some of their resources as tribute. In most cases, these vassal states were given a good deal of autonomy. In some cases, these vassals became trusted advisors and were allowed to form assemblies which could dictate policy or even pass laws, at least within the limits set by the primary ruler of the empire. But anything resembling actual democratic power residing in the hands of those who did not have control of either land or military force was rare outside of relatively small communal groups which were somehow able to avoid conquest and subjugation. Some historians argue that there were some relatively large-scale proto-democratic groups, citing evidence from Phoenicia around 1100 BC, but it's unclear if even these groups were short-lived exception or a cultural norm, as the records have been largely lost to time. Others point to records of formal assemblies existing in the Indian subcontinent, which may have been similar to modern parliaments, but the nature of these assemblies is widely debated, as it's unclear if these groups were appointed by local assemblies or filled by landed nobles. Regardless, these would still be the exceptions and not the norm. Western scholars tend to point to Athens as the birthplace of democracy, citing that in 594 BC, an aristocrat appointed to lead the ruling council of the city implemented reforms that expanded citizenship access, and with it, who had the right to participate in ruling assemblies and councils. Greek politician Pericles described the system, writing, quote, "Its administration favors the many instead of the few. This is why it is called a democracy. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If no social standing, achievement in public life falls to reputation for capacity, class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit, nor again does poverty bar the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition. The freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life." But this expansion of access was not nearly the same as modern universal suffrage. There were still requirements around property ownership, military service, and place of birth, and the large slave population of Athens could not vote even if they acquired their freedom, and the right, of course, was only extended to men. This meant that far more people were excluded from voting than were included, to the point that estimates were that at any given time only between 10% and 20% of the total population participated in the democratic processes offered to citizens. The Athenian experiment with representation ended when they were conquered by Philip of Macedon in 338 BC. He installed himself monarch and made Athens a vassal state. But some of these Greek ideas appear to have spread west when the king of Rome was removed from power and sent into exile in 509 BC. Rather than replace the old king with a new monarch, instead a Roman republic emerged. This republic passed laws which included citizenship rights, and these rights were written on tablets and put on display at least as early as 449 BC. These tablets spelled out specific citizenship rights regarding things like court processes, property, inheritance, and other legal matters. It also called for a census every 5 years so that the empire could record and count citizens. And arguably most importantly, the citizen was given the right to at least have some control in saying who ruled them. Citizenship was a birthright for children of Roman citizens, but it could also be granted by local authorities for acts that they deemed to be a public service, so long as those leaders were given that privilege to do so by leaders in Rome. But citizenship rights also came with citizenship obligations. They were expectations for service, particularly with regards to the military. There were also different levels of citizenship, with different kinds of citizenship having different rights and privileges, and the highest level of citizenship were only available to men. But even with all these caveats, it was still a remarkable expansion of access. And offers of access to citizenship were often used to convince rivals to join the Roman Empire rather than going to war with it. Would you rather be a citizen in an empire or the property of a king? But within this governing structure, during times of crisis there were provisions that allowed for the appointment of a special magistrate who would be granted total executive authority to resolve the crisis. This person would be given the title of dictator. They were usually a general or military leader who was asked to resolve an emergency that couldn't wait for debate and deliberation. But understanding the danger of one person having this much power, the appointment was always to be temporary. The granting of dictatorial power was not entirely uncommon. Records indicate that during the roughly 482 years the Roman Republic existed, a dictator was appointed on at least 85 different occasions. Julius Caesar personally was selected 4 different times, but Caesar declined to give back his power the final time, deciding he no longer wanted the job to be temporary, declaring himself dictator perpetuo, or dictator for life. This led to a series of civil wars which functionally ended the Roman Republic and began the Roman Empire. But even after the Republic was ended, many if not most of the rights of Roman citizens remained, and it was still respected throughout the empire to be a Roman citizen. In 212 AD, the emperor issued a decree that expanded citizenship rights to all free men in Rome who were not freed slaves or part of newly conquered areas. The given reason was to honor them, but Roman historian Cassius Dio argued it was also to tax them, writing, quote, "This was the reason why he made all the people in his empire Roman citizens. Nominally he was honoring them, but his real purpose was to increase the revenues by this means, inasmuch as aliens did not have to pay most of its taxes." By 286, the Roman Empire had been split into 2 partitions. In 293, the 2 partitions became 4, each with their own emperor. Emperor Constantine was able to reunite the empire in 324, and at the age of 40 he converted to Christianity, though it should be said there's a great deal of scholarly debate as if this was a true conversion or a political calculation. A Roman historian wrote that Constantine had a vision just before a pivotal battle, writing, quote, "At the time of the midday sun, when the day was just turning, he said he saw with his own eyes up in the sky, resting over the sun, a cross-shaped trophy formed from light, and a text attached to it which said, 'By this conquer.' Amazement at the spectacle seized both him and the whole company of soldiers, which was then accompanying him on a campaign he was conducting somewhere, and witnessed the miracle." But Constantine had also claimed that he experienced a divine vision of the Roman deities Apollo and Victory, granting him laurel wreaths of health and a long reign 2 years prior, in 310, just before another battle. Regardless of the sincerity of his faith, what isn't in dispute is that Constantine changed the state religion to Christianity, and replaced much of the religious iconography of his predecessors with Christian symbols. In a basilica built by the Roman emperor he defeated, he erected a stone statue of himself holding a Christian battle standard, in its hand with the inscription that translates to, "By this sign, Constantine had freed Rome from the yoke of the tyrant." Though once again unified, the center of the empire shifted when Constantine moved the capital of the empire from Rome to Constantinople. And Constantine's reunification didn't last. By 395, the empire was divided once again, and eventually the partition from which the Roman Empire began, which included Rome itself, was captured by Germanic forces around 476. Some have argued the change from Roman polytheism to Christianity was a significant contributing factor in the decline of the Roman Empire, although the fact that Constantine had to reunify the empire shows divisions were already there before the changes of faith occurred. Most agree the reduced flexibility of Christianity did create some challenges for groups of different faiths to remain in the empire. Religious discrimination wasn't new to Rome. Certainly Christians had been exposed to it many times, But Roman polytheism was somewhat more flexible than Christianity, as under Christian beliefs, there is only one God permitted, and Christians famously defaced statues of what they believed to be false gods and demanded conversions and baptism. Regardless of the causes of the fall of Rome, the end of Rome meant the end of Roman citizenship. But the late spread of Christianity, and specifically the rise and influence of what would become the Roman Catholic Church, served as a cornerstone for the argument of divine right to rule by the landed nobility of Western Europe. The Catholic Church specifically became a unifying force against the newly emerging threat of the Islamic Caliphate, which arrived on the Iberian Peninsula. Pope Leo II crowned Charlemagne the first Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day 800 AD, making him the first Holy Roman Emperor, a title that remained in existence for the next 1,000 years in one form or another. Charlemagne appeared to take his role in the Church quite seriously, demanding conversion of those he conquered, including forced baptism of Saxons and executions of those who refused conversion, earning him the nickname Butcher of the Saxons. The fall of Rome also meant the destruction of much of Roman history and literature. Catholic monasteries became a place where many of these documents were preserved, and the Catholic Church continued to teach in Latin, as it was the only language that had been taught throughout the empire that people with local languages could still understand. In addition, many of the oldest versions of the Bible were written in ancient Greek, leading scholars to study that language as well. This meant that most European scholars, regardless of their native language, would likely also learn Latin and possibly ancient Greek. And before the printing press, there were a very limited number of books, so those written in shared languages create a kind of shared cultural catalog for Western European scholars around Greek and Roman writings and letters. And so, while the city of Rome fell long before Constantinople, the influence of Latin and the writing kept and produced by the Catholic Church deeply influenced Western Europe long after Constantinople fell in 1453. As kingdoms grew in size, the need for decentralized administration also grew. With it, other variations of parliamentary systems re-emerged. These assemblies were able to help rulers create laws and policies to govern, and allow them to acquire additional tax revenue from vassals without revolt, as the vassals were involved in the decision-making process. But the ruler generally retained ultimate authority, usually citing their power again came from divine right, which was passed down along family bloodlines. And the vassalized rulers who usually made up the parliaments were also generally landed elite or tribal leaders who themselves cited divine rights to their land and property by bloodlines. Through this arrangement, in some places, nobles began to gain enough power that they had some real leverage over the rulers. One of the most well-known examples of this in Western culture is the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, where the English king conceded rights to appeal on his authority, including the right to appeal imprisonment through an impartial court known as habeas corpus. By 1505, the nobility in the Kingdom of Poland had gained so much power that the king largely had to defer to Parliament in matters of governance. In 1573, the kingdoms of Poland and Lithuania merged to create the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the approximately 40,000 people who could claim connection to nobility was a number equal to about 10% of the total population, and they elected a king commonwealth. The new king's power was severely limited, making him almost a figurehead, as most of the power was given to the parliament. The chancellor appointed by the parliament described this relationship in Latin with a phrase that translated to, "The king reigns and does not govern." European empires continued to expand, even becoming transatlantic. Within these empires, there were increasing religious conflicts, as the Protestant Reformation was leading to wars with Catholic powers. This Reformation also caused many to question core religious beliefs, including around divine rule. In 1521, the Pope named Henry VIII Defender of the Faith for writing a book attacking Protestants. 15 years later, Henry banned the Catholic Church for refusing to annul his marriage, which he believed was cursed because he had not been able to have a male heir with his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Henry then created the Church of England, which granted him the right to divorce he sought, allowing him, after a series of marriages, to have a male heir. After Henry's death, his son did take the throne, but only for a few years, dying at the age of 15. He was replaced by Henry's daughter, from his original marriage, the still Catholic Mary Tudor, in 1553. Mary attempted to restore the Catholic Church as the state religion, but she died after only 5 years on the throne, with no heir. The next in line to the throne was Henry's daughter Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the only child born from Henry's brief marriage to Anne Boleyn, who he had murdered for treason when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. But Elizabeth was a Protestant, and so when she became queen in 1558, she restored the Church of England that her father had created. During her reign, she leaned into being portrayed as a kind of religious icon, with many referring to her as the Virgin Queen, to allude to the Virgin Mary. Having no children, Elizabeth negotiated to have her crown passed to the King of Scotland, King James. James's mother, much like Elizabeth's, had also been a queen who was executed, this time for being a Catholic. James also leaned into his connection to divinity and the divine right of kings, famously commissioning the King James Bible. But King James's son, Charles, did not seem to have the same inclination. He married a Catholic French princess and attempted to push unpopular reforms onto the Protestant parliament. Eventually, this conflict led to civil war, and the Protestant-led parliament, headed by Oliver Cromwell, had him executed in 1625. Cromwell was then named Lord Protector. While the monarchy was able to regain power after Cromwell's death, the precedent had been set that Parliament could defeat and execute a monarch, even of a major empire. While all of this was going on in England, the Spanish were learning that even all the wealth of the New World was not enough to stop a Protestant revolution. By 1588, Dutch Protestants were finally able to win their bloody civil war for independence with the Catholic Habsburg Empire. And rather than choosing a king, they formed a confederacy without a central ruling monarch. As their war for independence was in large part over religious freedom, the Netherlands became a destination for religious refugees from all over Europe. This included members of a group of English Puritans who fled to the city of Leiden before later traveling across the ocean to start a colony in America, landing at Plymouth Rock. So many refugees came to the Netherlands that nearly 50% of the total population in the 17th and 18th century were first-generation immigrants. But rather than this flood of religious refugees being a problem for the Dutch, they proved to be a huge asset. Many who came were already involved in mercantile trades, as the religious persecution they suffered meant that they were excluded from owning land or being part of the nobility. And so these merchants made the Dutch East India Company grow into one of the richest organizations in the world. Profits from trade were invested into rapid industrialization projects within the Netherlands, and as a result, this relatively tiny company became one of the richest in the world in just a few generations, not from military expansion, but from trade and industrial investment. The changing economic climate also meant that being born into nobility was becoming less important as other paths emerged. A person could now become incredibly rich without significant land ownership, and that wealth could bring great influence as many landed nobles and even entire kingdoms began to find themselves deep in debt and in need of loans, often from military expansionism. The printing press and increased urbanization also meant that new ideas spread very quickly. Many intellectuals and scholars began openly questioning nearly all aspects of society. It was during this time that René Descartes famously argued one cannot truly believe in anything other than one's own personal experience, writing, Cogito ergo sum, Latin for, I think, therefore I am. Latin remained a unifying language of scholars, and this shared language also meant many tended to read the same Latin texts, including many texts from the Roman Republic talking about overthrowing monarchies. There was a great deal of discussion about natural laws and natural rights, which John Locke defined as life, liberty, and the state. These arguments were highly influential to the leaders of the American Revolution, including Thomas Jefferson, who began the Declaration of Independence with the words, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." But even as the Americans revolted against the rule by British monarchs, the original government they formed was not designed to assure universal rights. The right to vote was only extended to men who owned property. And while this was a dramatic expansion that removed the requirement for noble blood, it still restricted access to voting economically. After the American Revolution, in part because of its support of the Americans in their fight against their English rivals, the French monarchy found itself deep in debt. Attempts to resolve these issues led to incredible inflation for basic goods, most notably for bread. Poor harvests in 1788 and 1789 increased these food shortages to a crisis level, and the government was unable to borrow significantly. Those who had money to help the government in the church and the nobility balked at the call to pay more without something in exchange. They demanded the king convene an assembly known as the Estates General, which would allow them to vote on how the money would be spent, and presumably increase their relative power over the monarchy. However, an Estates General had not been called since 1614, over 150 years prior, and the king was resistant to any kind of parliamentary check on his power. But as riots continued to break out and debt grew, the king conceded and allowed for the assembly to meet in hopes of getting more tax revenue to pay debts and resolve the shortages. The assembly was to follow the same rules set out in 1614, meaning it would be divided into groups or estates of representatives. Representatives for the first estate would be selected from the clergy of the Catholic Church, the second would set representatives in the nobility, and everyone else would be sent to the third estate. Representatives would be able to vote on proposals in their separate estates, but each estate only provided one vote toward the final decision, meaning each estate had equal power. The Catholic Church owned about 10% of the total land in France. The church also collected tithes of around 10% from the around 100,000 members of the clergy in France. They selected 303 members to send to represent the first estate. Most were parish priests. Around 400,000 members of the landed nobility existed in France, and they made up the second estate. They owned about 25% of the land, generally making their income from rent and feudal payment systems. They sent 322 representatives. The rest of France, making up between 97 and 98% of the total population, were represented by 210 members of the Third Estate. And while the members of the Third Estate were sent ostensibly to represent the interests of the common folk, they themselves were highly educated. 2/3 held at least some sort of legal qualification, and nearly half worked in what were called venal offices, meaning they had paid government office positions of one kind or another, generally in the judicial system. All of this meant while the clergy and nobility only made up about 2 to 3% of the total population, they controlled two-thirds of the voting power of the assembly. The king had hoped these assemblies would quickly approve a proposed budget and then dissolve. But many of the representatives, particularly from the Third Estate, were sent with lists of grievances from their constituents, which they demanded be addressed by the assembly. Additionally, the Third Estate, having nearly twice as many representatives as the other two combined, was calling for representatives to have individual votes and not go by the one-third for each estate rule. This call was joined by many in the clergy, who had come not from wealthy churches but instead were local parish priests. These local priests were concerned that the wealthy church leaders would outvote them in the First Estate, making their votes meaningless. But if the Third Estate proposal passed, and they voted with the Third Estate, then their votes could actually matter. Seeing he was losing control of the process, the king attempted to end the assembly and send the representatives home, locking the door to the assembly hall. But the majority of representatives refused to leave. When they found the door to the assembly hall locked, they convened at a nearby tennis court and declared themselves the National Assembly, calling for a new constitution. As rumors spread that the king planned to send soldiers to disperse the assembly, in protest, a mob stormed the royal fortress and prison in Paris known as the Bastille. After skirmishes between the crowd and the outnumbered defenders led to casualties, the commander of the fortress agreed to surrender. This was likely in an effort to limit bloodshed on both sides. After the crowd was allowed to enter, the commander was taken by the mob to City Hall and executed. His head was then placed on a pike and paraded around the city. In an attempt to quiet the uprising, the king appointed the Marquis de Lafayette to lead the Parisian National Guard. Lafayette had credibility as a reformer, having fought in the American Revolution, and his appointment was intended to assure that the king did not intend to disperse the assembly by force. But the king's inability to stop the mob led many nobles to flee, and once outside of France, many of them called for countries like Austria and Prussia to invade France in defense of the rights of the nobility. They weren't wrong about the assembly not being favorable toward the rights of the nobility. In August, the assembly abolished feudalism, canceling the feudal dues, which made up the bulk of the income of the nobility. And then they abolished tithes, angering the Catholic Church. The assembly also passed laws providing voting rights to all French men over the age of 25 who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of labor. This would be part of a broader messaging by the new French government, which believed in, quote, liberty, equality, and fraternity. But none of this gave the people bread, reduced the debt, or quelled the unrest. Well aware of the anger of the French people, in September, additional reinforcements of the Royal Guard were brought to Versailles to protect the royal family. On their arrival, as was tradition, a banquet was held in their honor. But doing so was covered in the press as, quote, a gluttonous orgy, and around 7,000 armed protesters marched on Versailles, ransacking the palace and killing a number of guards. The king and his family escaped, but the king and the National Assembly were soon relocated to Paris by Lafayette's men in order to better be able to protect them. In November, the Assembly further angered the Catholic Church by seizing all church property, which was again about 10% of all the land in France. Without land or tithes, the responsibility of the church with regards to paying the clergy, as well as the charity of the church, now fell on the French state. Unwilling to fund them, in February of 1790, the Assembly dissolved large numbers of religious orders and monasteries. And in November of 1790, members of the clergy were ordered to make a loyalty pledge to the new French state. Many, if not most, refused, which drove large numbers into the same exile as the nobility. None of this bought more bread, reduced debt, or quelled unrest. As solutions failed to emerge, political infighting in the assembly grew. Populist figures became powerful opposition voices and were elevated by news coverage, particularly in Paris. The military, which had traditionally been divided between officers from the nobility and soldiers from the common folk, were having difficulty maintaining order, with the traditional officer corps leaving the country and often organizing against them in other countries in hopes of invading and restoring the nobility. The repression of an attempted mutiny by a general loyal to the king was praised by one side for putting down the mutiny, while attacked by the other for its brutality against the common soldiers. And with more and more nobles fleeing, a leadership vacuum emerged, making control even more difficult. In June of 1791, the king and his family attempted to flee Paris, likely to Austria, where the queen's brother was king. The plan was almost certainly to organize an army while in exile to invade France and take power back from the National Assembly. But they were caught almost immediately, and once caught, they were forced to return to Paris and placed under house arrest. In August, the King of Prussia issued a declaration which threatened invasion if the French king and his family were harmed, and it was already feared that Austria might invade given the royal connections and attempted escape. While likely this letter was an attempt to protect the king, the threat only inflamed tensions more. The king's wife, Marie Antoinette, had long been a target by the French press and generally used as a convenient scapegoat by the king's political rivals to start popular support for reforms. Having her brother threaten to invade only escalated this narrative more. As Austrians and Prussian forces began amassing on the French border, many called for preemptive wars. When demands by the French for these forces to leave the border were not complied with, in April of 1792, the National Assembly voted for war. The war began poorly. Austrian and Prussian forces began moving into France toward Paris. A letter from the Duke of Brunswick, who led one of the armies against France, reached Paris on August 1, 1792. It stated the goal of the invasion was, quote, to put an end to the anarchy in the interior of France, to check the attacks upon the throne and the altar, to reestablish the legal power, to restore the king, the security, and the liberty of which he is now deprived, and to place him in a position to exercise once more the legitimate authority which belongs to him. It went on to say that if the National Assembly did not surrender, that, quote, they will wreak an exemplary and forever memorable vengeance by giving up the city of Paris to a military execution and total destruction, and the rebels guilty of assassinations to the execution that they have merited. Fearing they might turn against them should the army reach Paris, on August 10th, 1792, revolutionary forces marched on the mansion where the king and his family were staying, known as the Tuileries. The guard included highly skilled Swiss mercenaries, but they were vastly outnumbered. After a bloody battle, the king and his family fled, seeking protection within the National Assembly Hall. The surviving Swiss guard, who were told to stand down, did surrender, but many were murdered on the spot or imprisoned. At the Assembly Hall, on the arrival of the king, those present voted, quote, to temporarily relieve the king, effectively suspending the French monarchy. Less than a month later, on September 2nd, 1792, thousands of prisoners were pulled from their cells and taken before revolutionary tribunals. Most of these prisoners had no connection to the king. They were held for petty crimes such as prostitution or forgery, or were priests who declined loyalty pledges. But regardless of the crime, the sentence for guilt was almost always the same: execution. While this was not officially sanctioned by the National Assembly, the actions were openly encouraged by some of its members. Georges d'Estaing gave a speech stating, quote, we ask that anyone refusing to give personal service or to furnish arms shall be punished by death. Jean-Paul Marat gave an even more explicit instruction, saying, good citizens, go to the abbey to seize priests, especially the officers of the Swiss Guard and their accomplices, and run a sword through them. A British diplomat who observed what was happening at one of the first groups saw that 18 men were executed, quote, with circumstances of barbarity too shocking to describe. A group of 115 priests who refused to swear loyalty were brought before the tribunal, reportedly having been promised that the sentence would be exile if they came willingly. But when they arrived, unless they promised to, quote, swear to be faithful to the nation and to maintain liberty and equality or die defending it, they were reportedly taken to a nearby courtyard and killed by men armed with axes, spikes, swords, and pistols. All told, records show that around 2,800 prisoners were pulled from various cells on various charges, and of those, between 1,176 and 1,614 were killed by the informal citizen, most after only a brief interrogation to assess their loyalty to the revolution. Estimates were around 3/4 were held on common and criminal offenses, completely unrelated to politics, including 66 children. But one of those killed was a close friend of Marie Antoinette, Marie-Thérèse Louise. While the many gruesome descriptions of how she was killed are disputed, most agree that after her death, her head was removed from her body, placed on a pike, and paraded around Marie Antoinette's window, while a crowd shouted the victim's name to make sure Marie knew she was dead. After the event, figures like Robespierre attempted to claim those killed were primarily aristocrats, but records show this simply wasn't true. Robespierre conceded what was done was illegal, but he argued so that was the revolution itself, stating, quote, citizens, did you want a revolution without revolution? On January 17, 1793, the French King Louis XVI was sentenced to death by the National Assembly, and he was executed 4 days later on January 21st. But this did not give the people bread, reduce the debt, or end the war. In fact, more countries declared war on France, leading France to be at war with nearly all of their neighbors at the same time. Conscription laws were passed in February of 1793 to have enough soldiers to stop the forces which continued to advance toward Paris. Almost immediately, riots broke out in protest across the country, and counter-revolutionary forces within France were becoming nearly as threatening to the new French government as external invaders. In April, the government formed a Committee of Public Safety to bring stability and impose order. The group attempted to convict Marat for the September massacres, but not only did they fail to convict, those who accused Marat found themselves accused of treason for going after him. On June 2nd, the National Assembly was surrounded by an estimated 80,000 protesters calling for the Revolutionary Tribunal to find corrupt politicians they blamed for the shortages and the failures of the war, encouraged by supporters of Marat. The Assembly were able to pass a new constitution in the summer that provided things like universal male suffrage, added a number of civil rights, promoted public assistance, and proclaimed France's government existed with the consent of the people as part of a declaration of the rights of man and the citizens. But there were still bread shortages, there was still debt, and it didn't end the wars. Marat was assassinated by a political rival less than a month later, and the Committee for Public Safety, now led by Robespierre, suspended the brand new constitution to focus on suppressing dissent, which conveniently included the execution of Robespierre's political rivals. Price controls were put in place, but they only made farmers more reluctant to sell to Paris, which only increased the shortages. As conditions grew worse, the scapegoat shifted to allegations of large numbers of hoarders who were brought to trial and executed, along with other political rivals. But once again, there was still not enough bread, still too much debt, and the war raged on. With no one else to blame for the failures of the government, eventually even Robespierre faced the guillotine in July of 1794, just over a year after Murat's assassination. This period of mass executions came to be known as the Reign of Terror. During this time, an estimated 300,000 people were arrested and charged as counter-revolutionaries, and between 16,000 and 40,000 were executed. Throughout the terror, the war continued. Conscription remained unpopular, but it was effective, allowing the French to be able to hold off the invasion from all sides. Not only were they able to stop the invasion, but as the war continued, the French military became more organized and effective. Young military leaders were given opportunities to lead based on merit rather than previous officer corps of the nobility, who were selected by birth. The tide of war began to shift, and the one part of the government which seemed at all capable was the military. But there was still no bread. On October 5th, 1795, the anger at the failures of the government to meet most basic needs rose to the point that around 25,000 pro-royalist forces had surrounded the assembly hall. Because of the needs of war, only around 5,000 troops were available to defend them. A young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte arrived at the scene and called for 40 cannons to be brought to aid in the defense of the assembly. As the protesters began to threaten to enter the assembly and to do harm to those inside, he ordered his men to fire grapeshot into the crowd. When all was said and done, around 300 royalist protesters were dead, and Napoleon was on his way to being appointed commander of the Army of the Interior. Soon after, the wars began to turn so much in France's favor that France was now on the offensive. Napoleon was able to lead an invasion force in the country where he had been born, Italy, forcing the Austrians who had controlled the area to agree to peace treaties. By 1799, Napoleon was named Consul of the First French Republic. 5 years later, he declared himself emperor. The parallels of these titles to Rome was, of course, no accident. Even when Napoleon was eventually defeated and the French monarchy restored for a time in 1815, these events fundamentally changed how Europeans viewed their rulers. Napoleon, a man only loosely connected by a link to a minor Tuscan noble family, was able to rise to conquer most of Europe. And where he conquered, French laws removed feudal systems, and that genie could not simply be put back in the bottle. Peasants could not be expected to return to serfdom without protest. And even if they could be made to by force, industrialization was making the old land-focused wealth model obsolete. By 1848, with massive food shortages brought on by the potato blight leading to popular uprisings all across Europe, nationalist movements began calling for democratic reforms. In France, the restored monarchy was forced to become a republic. With a campaign harkening back to France's recent empire, Napoleon's grandnephew was elected in a landslide, receiving 74.2% of the vote. A few years later, he declared himself Napoleon III, emperor, following a military coup. This coup was his third attempted coup, having previously failed in 1836 and 1840 respectively. He led France until 1870, when Prussia invaded, and he was captured at the Battle of Sedan after a disastrous defeat. The Prussians forced the French to allow German forces a victory parade through Paris, and the use of the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles to crown their new king, Wilhelm of Germany, emperor of a newly unified German state. They were also forced to pay an amount of reparations equal to the price that Napoleon had demanded of Prussia decades before, adjusted for inflation. Germany had its own round of protests in 1848, with massive protests in Berlin leading the king to hold a procession through the streets wearing the black, red, and gold tricolors of the revolution. However, the reforms that actually emerged only entrenched the powers of the state and added additional powers to use the military to repress any dissent going forward. Arguably, it was these additional military powers that allowed Germany to defeat the French so effectively, unifying Germany under the new German emperor and creating what they were then referred to as the Second Reich, the First Reich being Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire. Populist uprisings in Hungary and Poland failed to bring revolutionary change, instead bringing greater military repression. The power of popular uprisings were showing themselves to be generally less than the power of the now industrializing state military forces. Much like Napoleon's whiff of grapeshot stopped the royalists' ambitions, technology and military organization had reached a point where popular uprisings were dependent on the military not being loyal to the regime. In Italy, the 1848 Italian nationalist revolutions were unsuccessful initially, likely because Italy had long been divided among independent city-states such as Venice and Florence, rather than having a unified national identity to rally behind. But in 1861, Italian nationalist forces were able to overthrow foreign rule and create a constitutional monarchy, declaring its independence first from the Austrian rulers in the north and later from the Bourbon rulers in the south. In 1870, even the Catholic Church fell, as the Pope was forced to concede Rome to the new Italian king, unifying Italy for the first time since the fall of Rome under a constitutional monarchy. Throughout all of this, Europeans' colonial ambitions added incentives to rationalize actions around racial superiority. New ideas around race that were developed during the centuries since the Columbian Exchange have been used to justify any number of atrocities. What had previously been rationalized on religious grounds during the Inquisitions and Holy Wars now had to be rationalized around race, as the colonial powers wished to continue exploiting those who were willing to be Christians. New scientific arguments around the origin of species were plugged into these already existing racial rationalizations. Evolutionary arguments were used as a lens to attempt to further justify inhumane cruelty in pursuit of wealth and power. Rather than an evil act being rationalized as necessary because of their opposition to your God's will, the justification for your evil behavior could be claimed as arguments based on natural law and racial superiority. Darwin's ideas regarding evolution were used by political movements to argue for ethnic and racial superiority of whatever the dominant ethnic and racial group of a given country was. In America, eugenicists would testify before Congress that the Eastern Europeans and Italians were genetically inferior and therefore should not be allowed to immigrate to America lest they contaminate. But in Italy and Eastern Europe, different eugenicists would argue the exact opposite, claiming their racial superiority by citing connections to the greatness of Rome and ancient Greece. Social Darwin ideas were quick to gain traction with those in power, as they could be used to claim that whoever has power deserves it. And even better, using eugenic arguments, they could argue their children deserved it as well. This transfer from the will of the divine to the will of the free market became a very short ideological journey for them. And this naturalistic fallacy applied to race and genetics became the basis not just for exploitation, but for ethnic cleansing. Conservative backlash to democratic ideas grew in influence, with many arguing that some were meant to rule while others were meant to be ruled. In 1896, Italian political scientist Gaetano Mosca argued that all societies are made up of, quote, an organized minority, which ruled over the, quote, disorganized majority. He said in a 1904 interview, quote, I can certainly call myself an anti-democrat, but I am not an anti-liberal. Indeed, I am opposed to a pure democracy precisely because I am a liberal. I believe that the ruling class ought not to be monolithic and homogeneous, but ought to consist of elements which are diverse in regard to origin and interests. When, instead, political power originates from a single source, even if this be elections with universal suffrage, I regard it as dangerous and liable to become oppressive. Democratic Jacobinism is an illiberal doctrine precisely because it subordinates everything to a single force, that of the so-called majority, on which it does not set any limits. The argument that some are meant to lead and others to follow led to a growing veneration of monarchy and a condemnation of democratic processes, which would lead to giving power to rule to those who should be ruled. In France, disillusioned socialist Georges Sorel wrote arguments for the need to create a kind of political religion that rejected democracy, writing, quote, nothing is more aristocratic than democracy. Over time, he and many other former leftists began embracing some aspects of far-right ideologies which argued virtue in political violence and centralized power and control in a so-called vanguard of the exceptional who were best suited to rule. Sorel's shift was praised by French right-wing figures like Charles Maurras, who said, quote, a socialism liberated from the democratic and cosmopolitan elements fits nationalism well, as a well-made glove fits a beautiful hand. This fusion of the far left and the far right can be seen in the arguments of Enrico Corradini as he advocated for what he called the proletarian nationalism shortly after the end of World War I. He framed his argument as being in opposition to the plutocracy, that is, ruled by the wealthy, similar to Marxist arguments. But rather than the unification for the eventual war around class, his was around nationalism. In 1910, he wrote of Italy, quote, we are the proletarian people in respect to the rest of the world. Nationalism is our socialism. This established, nationalism must be founded on the truth that Italy is morally and materially a proletarian nation. He argued that rather than a class revolution, the world actually needed imperialist rule. He believed that imperialists needed to replicate socialist movements in terms of, quote, maximum cohesion, concentration of forces, iron discipline, and utter ruthlessness. He believed these were required to gain and maintain power over those he believed were not fit to rule. He would later write, quote, we must start by recognizing the fact that we are the proletarian nations as well as the proletarian classes. That is to say, there are nations whose living conditions are subject to the way of life of other nations, just as classes are. Once this is realized, nationalism must insist firmly on this truth. Italy is, materially and morally, a proletarian nation. In January of 1915, the first meeting of the Fascists of Revolutionary Action was held. Fascist was a reference to the bundle of rods with an axe which would be carried by those serving imperial magistrates and rulers in ancient Greece and Rome. The items in the bundle contained all of the equipment needed for the magistrate to be able to inflict corporal punishment or perform executions on his subjects. Attending this meeting was a young Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had been the editor of a socialist newspaper called Avanti, but he had been recently removed for his anti-German beliefs. He attended this meeting and reportedly argued, quote, for the ideals of justice and liberty for which oppressed peoples must acquire the right to belong to those national communities from which they descended. Mussolini soon became a leader of this group that sought to expand the borders of Italy to include all ethnic Italians. This goal was in opposition to the Germans in World War I. Reportedly, British intelligence paid him a wage of £100 a week, or about $9,600 in today's money, for his work publishing calls for intervention in the war against the Germans and Austrian-Hungary alliance. While Mussolini came from a socialist background, he condemned socialist class theory generally in favor of a nationalist racial theory, saying, quote, "The nation has not disappeared. We used to believe the concept was totally without substance. Instead, we see the nation arise as a palpitating reality before us. Class cannot destroy the nation. Class reveals itself as a collection of interests, but the nation is a history of sentiments, traditions, language, culture, and race. Class can become an integral part of the nation, but the one cannot eclipse the other. The class struggle is a vain formula, without effect and consequence wherever one finds a people that has not integrated itself into a proper linguistic and racial confines, where the national problem has not been definitely resolved. In such circumstances, the class movement finds itself impaired by an inauspicious historic climate." Mussolini got his wish for war against the Germans, and he personally fought in World War I in active trench battles for around 9 months before injuries from a mortar shell led to his discharge and return to writing. But despite being on the opposite side of the war, Germany had very similar ideological arguments that were gaining traction. German sociologist Johann Pledge described his movement as, quote, "National Socialism," which he described as being a direct opposition to the, quote, "ideas of 1789, which to him included things like the rights of man, democracy, and individualism. He argued for racial solidarity rather than class solidarity, stating that his, quote, "racial comrades should unite to create a socialist proletariat society in opposition to capitalist countries such as Britain, which was a pretext for German war." When World War I was over, Mussolini helped to found the Italian Fascists of Combat. The group published a manifesto that called for universal suffrage, while also calling for privatization of some public sectors. The manifesto seemed to be trying to pick ideas that would appeal to both the left and right, but didn't gain much traction, and Mussolini reportedly considered briefly leaving politics entirely. But by 1920, the fascists had found an enemy to focus on in socialist groups, as the socialists had begun organizing strikes and occupations of factories in the middle of post-war economic distress. The communist revolution in Russia was likely front and center for both industrialists and the monarchy, and Mussolini was able to convince them to help fund the building of a paramilitary force of strikebreakers who would target the socialists. These became known as the Black Shirts. Now finding acceptance and funding from the political right, the group abandoned many of their past positions on universal suffrage, sale of church lands, and women's suffrage. They now called for the women's role in the workforce to be reduced and for banning birth control literature in the name of, quote, "family values." One fascist leader said of this change, quote, "Fascism would like to be conservative, but it will by being revolutionary." Mussolini also made explicit racial arguments, again shifting the class war narrative to a racial one, to argue for the superiority of Italy and Italians over their neighbors. In a speech in 1920, he said, quote, "When dealing with such a race as Slavic, inferior and barbarian, we must not pursue the carrot, but the stick policy. We should not be afraid of new victims. The Italian border should run across the Brenner Pass, Monteneveso, and the Dinaric Alps. I would say we can easily sacrifice 500,000 barbaric Slavs for 50,000 Italians." This shift to the right, combined with the messaging around Italian nationalism and racial superiority, caused an explosion in party membership from roughly 1,000 in 1919 to over 250,000 in 1921. By 1922, the fascist black shirts had grown large enough to not just destroy offices of socialist leaders, but to occupy entire towns and cities in northern Italy, demanding Italianization be imposed on non-Italian speakers. On October 24th, the fascists held a convention in Naples, where Mussolini ordered his black shirts to converge on Rome and take control of the public buildings in a show of force over the leftist government of the time. The King of Italy, perhaps afraid he would be unable to disperse the fascists, possibly also preferring the fascists over the socialists, decided not to act against the fascists and instead appointed Mussolini as prime minister. The fascists referred to this seizure of power as the March on Rome. Adolf Hitler took inspiration and attempted to do the same the following year in Germany with his failed Beerhall Putsch in Munich in 1923. Mussolini being made prime minister didn't remove all roadblocks under the Italian parliamentary system, and the fascists initially were unable to form a governing coalition in the Italian parliament. But over time, through intimidation and violence, which included the kidnapping and murder of the leader of the Socialist Party, the fascists took control of the majority. In protest of the violence, the opposition walked out, begging the King of Italy to act. Mussolini gave a speech to Parliament, absent the opposition who had left in protest, where he claimed personal responsibility for the violence, but also that he had done nothing wrong. And while the king technically had the power to remove him as prime minister, he likely feared his order would end in more violence, if it would be enforced at all. After a failed assassination attempt on Mussolini took place in 1926, even the token restraints placed on him by the Italian constitution were suspended around an argument of a national crisis. And so, once again harkening back to Rome, Mussolini declared de facto dictatorship and used the power of the Italian state to remove his opposition. Under Mussolini, Italy abandoned all pretense of fairness toward its colonial holdings, arguing that their racial superiority meant they could do as they wished in the Libyan colony that they acquired in 1912. They unleashed a campaign of mass executions, torture, and mutilation, often using chemical weapons to forcibly remove Libyans to concentration camps. Roughly half of the native population, over 100,000 people, were removed or killed between 1923 and 1932. When the Great Depression broke out in the 1930s, proponents of fascist ideologies were able to produce a laundry list of scapegoats: immigrants, Freemasons, communists, Jews, or any other ethnic minority. The message was simple: the people of our country are good, our culture is good, our race is good, so clearly someone else is at fault and must be stopped. In Germany, the Weimar government was particularly vulnerable to extremists gaining power because their parliament used a proportional representation formula that allowed fringe parties voting membership even if they earned less than 1% of the total votes in a given election. This led to fragmentation that made it difficult to form or maintain any kind of stable coalition government. In 1928, 41 different political parties were on the ballot and received votes. Of these, 15 received enough votes to get voting membership into the Reichstag. Among them were the Nazi Party, which got 2.63% of the vote, which gave them 12 of the 491 seats. In 1930, just after the start of the Great Depression, the Nazis were able to win 18.25% of the votes, giving them 107 seats out of 577 total, which puts them the second among the 37 parties on the ballot and the 15 who were able to get seats. 2 years later, with the Great Depression showing no end in sight, the Nazi Party got 37.27% of the vote, most of any group, and giving them 230 seats out of 608. And while this was more than any other party, it was still not close to a full majority. And while the communists and the Nazis couldn't agree on almost anything else, they were able to agree to call for a no-confidence vote to remove the current government and call for a new vote in November. In November, the Nazis' percentage went down to 33%, and the communists went up to 17%, so they combined were still right around 50%, but again, they were also strong enough to make sure that no coalition could be formed, and that a new vote would also be called again. Since the Nazis were the party that got more votes than any other party, they were able to join with the German party that wanted to restore the monarchy to negotiate for Adolf Hitler to become chancellor pending the elections scheduled for March of 1933. 6 days before this March election, there was an arson attack on the Reichstag. Hitler and the Nazis used this arson as a pretext to declare martial law, blaming the communists and using state power to violently target political opposition ahead of the election. Even with this violence, Nazis were still only able to get 43% of the vote, well short of majority, but more than double the next closest party, and this was enough for them to functionally bring an end to the Weimar Republic. The Nazis went on to ban all opposition parties so that when elections were held in November, the Nazis claimed 95.3% of the vote. Mussolini and Hitler, once on opposite sides of World War I, had become allies. In 1932, Mussolini published The Doctrine of Fascism, likely with the help of Italian philosopher Giovanni Gentile. In it they wrote, quote, "Granted that the 19th century was the century of socialism, liberalism, democracy, this does not mean the 20th century must also be the century of socialism, liberalism, democracy. Political doctrines pass, nations remain. We are free to believe that this is the century of authority, a century tending to the right, a fascist century. If the 19th century were the century of the individual, liberalism implies individualism, we are free to believe that this is the collective century, and therefore the century of the state. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. Fascism is a religious conception in which man is seen in his immanent relationship with a superior law and with an objective will that transcends the particular individual and raises him to a conscious member of a spiritual society. Whoever is seen in the religious politics of the fascist regime nothing but mere opportunism has not understood that fascism, besides being a system of government, is also, above all things, a system of thought. Fascist political parties emerged in many countries all around the world. In the United States, in February of 1939, the German-American Bund held a rally at Madison Square Garden, which was attended by over 20,000 people. After the Star-Spangled Banner was played, the first speaker of the night said to the audience, quote, "If George Washington were alive today, he would be friends with Adolf Hitler." In Spain, both Italy and Germany helped fund a coup which led to the Spanish Civil War that brought leader Francisco Franco to power. Between 1936 and 1939, estimates are between 58,000 and 200,000 people were killed by Franco's nationalist forces in an event that came to be known as the Terra Blanco, or White Terror. These killings were reportedly in response to similar killings by socialist-led Republican forces, with those killings be called the Red Terror. Estimates for those killed in the Red Terror are between 38,000 and 70,000. Many of those killed in the Red Terror were members of the Catholic clergy, which tended to support Franco. How these deaths took place is described differently in each area. In the Franco-supporting nationalist sections, it was reportedly organized and endorsed by the government authorities, while in the Red or Republican areas, it was more often done without the approval of the local authorities. A witness to both the White and the Red Terror wrote, quote, "I had the opportunity of being a witness to the repression in both sides. In the nationalist side, it was planned, methodical, cold. As they did not trust the local people, the authorities imposed their will by means of terror, committing atrocities in order to achieve their aim. Atrocities also took place in the Popular Front zone. It was something which both areas had in common, but the main difference was that in the Republican zones, the crimes were carried out by the local populace in the moments of passion and not by the authorities. The latter always tried to stop them. The assistance that I received from the Spanish Republican authorities in order to flee to safety is only one of the many examples, but this was not the case in the nationalist zone." A spokesman for Franco's forces said, quote, "You know what's wrong with Spain? Modern plumbing. In healthier times, spiritually healthier, you understand, plague and pestilence could be counted on to thin the Spanish masses. Now with modern sewage disposal, they simply multiply too fast. The masses are no better than animals, you understand, and you can't expect them to not become infested with the virus of Bolshevism. After all, rats and lice carry the plague." After winning the war in 1939, the chief prosecutor of Franco's army wrote, quote, "The native lands must be disinfected beforehand. And here is the work, weight and glory, entrusted by chance of destiny to military justice." In September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and in June of 1940, Italy joined the war as an ally of Germany against the French and the British. By 1943, Italy was captured by the Allies, and the King of Italy finally removed from power Mussolini. He was able to escape, but on April 28, 1945, he was recaptured and executed by Italian communist forces. 2 days later, on April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. An estimated 75 million people died during World War II. General Franco of Spain, despite accepting the help of Germany and Italy to get into power, kept Spain out of World War II. It was clear his regime preferred the Axis, with one of his spokesmen describing the World War II as, quote, "Bolshevism versus Europe." In 1940, he reportedly made an offer to Hitler to join in exchange for food and fuel, and the British holding of Gibraltar, as well as other parts of North Africa, but Hitler declined, and Spain stayed largely on the sidelines. Franco denied his regime was fascist, holding a referendum in 1947, which he declared Spain was still a monarchy, but he was regent for life. He reported over 95% of the vote in favor of his proposal. In addition to those killed during the White Terror and the war, in the years that followed, at least 35,000 and as many as 200,000 additional political opponents were either killed directly or died in prison, some from starvation. He remained in power until his death in 1975. History is awkward.